Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Nathalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Nathalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. Welcome to another episode of How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. This episode is different. Instead of sitting across from a guest, I am the one in the chair. In this solo episode, I share my own personal timeline of grief, loss and trauma, and trace how each experience shaped the ones that came after it. From what I learned about grief growing up, through infertility, miscarriages, the death of my daughter Amaya 3 days after she was born, the suicide of my mother 4.5 months later, the significant traumas in my adult life, separation, and single parenthood. This is the story behind the work. Now, the intention is not to center myself. It is to model what I ask of every guest, that your personal story is not separate from how you grieve or how you live through trauma. It is the lens through which you grieve. And understanding that lens changes everything. If you're carrying multiple losses, if your grief feels more complicated than you think it should, or if you support someone whose grief seems out of proportion to the immediate loss, this episode is for you. And I'm going to mention some free resources along here, and they are available on my website at nathaliehimmelrich.com in the free resources hub, including the beginner's guide to dealing with grief and trauma. And as we're approaching the 4-year mark, I'm going to ask you to rate this podcast with 5 stars if it has helped you feel less alone. It takes only 30 seconds and helps more grieving and traumatized people find this show when they need it most. If you have some more time spare, write a review or share with someone in need. So this idea of understanding how we grieve and how we deal with trauma and how our own personal story shapes that has been sitting with me for a long time. You know, every episode of this podcast, I sit with a guest and I ask them to do something courageous, to tell their story, to trace the thread of loss or trauma through their life and bring it into the light. To trust that their story matters, not because it's dramatic, but because it is true and because someone out there needs to hear it. And today I'm doing that myself. This is not an episode that came easily. And even though I've shared before, I am professionally someone who holds space for other people's pain, and this is where I'm comfortable. But turning the microphone towards myself is a different kind of exposure. But I have to come to understand that one of the things that most profoundly shapes how we grieve and how we respond to loss, how much we struggle, how much we can receive support or ask for it, is in our personal story. This is a story that came before the loss we are currently living. And if I'm asking you to look at yours, it's only right that I look at mine. So today I want to thread the lines between the different parts of my grief and my trauma through my own personal timeline. Not as a catalogue of suffering, but as an illustration of something I believe deeply, that grief does not arrive in a vacuum. It arrives into a life already shaped by previous losses, by the way we learned to cope, by the way we were taught grief is allowed to look like or not. So whether you are grieving yourself right now, whether you are dealing with trauma, or whether you are supporting someone who is, I hope this episode gives you a new lens, one that helps you make sense of why this loss, why this trauma at this time in this life feels the way it does for them. Let's have a look at what we learn before we lose. So before I get to the losses themselves, I want to start somewhere that took me years to understand was relevant at all. I want to start with what I have personally learned about grief before I consciously experienced it. As most of you know, I grew up in Switzerland, in a family that, like most families, had its own unwritten rules about emotions. My father is someone who, in his own words, is good at avoiding. He told me that himself. I remember I was standing in the garage with him years later, going through my mother's belonging, and he said it almost as an observation about himself. Matter of fact, like it was simply a trait, like being left-handed. And I recognized it because I had grown up inside that pattern. In my family of origin, grief was not something that was processed openly. Losses happened, like grandparents died, hard things occurred, and life continued. When my father's mother died, it was the first time I saw him or I remember him crying. He stayed functional, and so did I. He stayed strong. He even said to me, "You don't need to cry in certain situations," so that was the model. Now I can name that. I can identify it as a family system that prioritized avoidance over processing. But as a child, you don't have a name for it. You just absorb it. And you learn this is the way you do when something painful happens. You carry on. I also experienced developmental trauma in my early years, and you can learn more about that in episode 44. Experiences that at the time I had no framework to understand. And about 10 years ago, as an adult, I experienced a significant trauma that I've also previously shared. What I want you to hear now is this. None of my later grief arrived into an empty vessel. It arrived into a body and a nervous system that had already been shaped, already been teaching itself how to manage pain, how to deal with it, whether to be able to ask for help or not. And this is true for every single one of us. The grief you are in right now, or the trauma you are dealing with right now, is not just about this loss or this trauma. It's about every loss and trauma before it, and every lesson about how you were taught to deal with difficult things, with pain, with loss, whether that was conscious or not, long before this very specific event. I moved to Sydney, Australia in my adult years, after spending 5 years in Singapore. And it is in Sydney where I began my career in private practice, where I built my life, and where I started the journey towards becoming a mother. And that journey was not straightforward. My daughters were not conceived naturally, and I began assisted conception, a process I documented in a journal day by day, because I needed to make it real, to make it something I could hold on to. Only in retrospect, I fully understand the grief I had been caring about not becoming pregnant so easily. I didn't understand fully at the time that I was already grieving the version of conception I had imagined grieving the ease I had assumed would come, navigating medical procedure, uncertainty, and the particular loneliness of not knowing whether it would work. After my daughters were born, I also lost 2 pregnancies, 2 miscarriages, each one its own loss, its own small death that the world around me largely did not acknowledge as grief-worthy, because really I had lost a child in my arm that there are photos for. But miscarriage is grief. Infertility is grief. The loss of a version of your future, the family you imagined, the ease you hoped for, is grief. It does not have to involve a death certificate to be real. And so by the time I became pregnant with my twin daughters, I had already experienced a bit. I had already learned that wanting something deeply does not protect you from losing it. Then at 19 weeks pregnant, I received news that changed everything. My daughter Amaya, the younger of my identical twins, had multicystic kidneys, a condition called Potter syndrome, which is not compatible with life outside the womb. I remember hearing those words and feeling the floor shift beneath me. I was, in fact, traumatized by the diagnosis. I remembered the doctor at the time. He was suggesting something and I could not react. I was in such a shock that he would even suggest terminating one child in the womb. So, beside the trauma of that diagnosis, I was already grieving the life I had imagined, the future I had held in my body alongside her, which was now dissolving before it had begun. Now she was still alive, she was moving inside me, and I was already in grief. This is called anticipatory grief. And it is one of the most isolating forms of loss, because the world does not know how to respond to it. Like, I was pregnant, visibly, bodily pregnant, and also in some way bereaved. Those 2 things do not fit neatly together in anyone's understanding. Amaya was born alongside Ananda May in September 2011, and she lived for 3 days. 3 days. She was the second twin born. Her sister Ananda May was born first and was healthy. And on the 3rd day of their lives, Amaya died. So I became a bereaved mother while simultaneously becoming a mother of a living child. And I had to hold both. A newborn needed me completely, and a grief that was completely in its own right. The comments people made in those early days are ones now I teach from. At least you have one and she's healthy. Or you must be strong for your husband and your child. These were said with good intentions. They were even cognitively true. But they landed as silencing, as instructions to compress my grief into a small space, small enough not to inconvenience anyone. And I was doing all of these more than 16,000 kilometers away from my family in Switzerland, completely geographically isolated from the people who knew me before I was a mother and before I was a grieving mother. So if you are someone supporting a grieving person right now, what I just described is what it can feel like to grieve without adequate witness. It is not dramatic, it is quiet and crushing. And the absence of the right kind of support in early grief shapes everything that comes after. So whether your family is close by or not, what matters is to be witnessed in your grief. Four and a half months later, my mother's suicide. So I was still in the early weeks of grief for Maya, still learning how to be a mother to a newborn while carrying the loss of her twin, and still trying to find my footing on either of those mothering tasks. So 4.5 months after Maya died, my mother died by suicide. I am not going to smooth over the weight of that sentence. I want it to land. I had just lost my daughter. I was still more than 16,000 kilometers away from home. And now I had also lost my mother. In another, most traumatic way a parent can be lost. Suicide bereavement is its own category of grief. It carries with it the question that have no answers. It carries a lot of stigma. It carries, for many people, guilt, a relentless retracing of moments, looking for what could have been different. It carries the particular violence of an image you did not witness but cannot stop imagining. Just the night before, I had spoken to my mother. And that conversation and that image didn't stop replaying in my mind. And for me, it arrived on top of fresh child loss in the context of new motherhood, at a geographical distance that made any practical support from family nearly impossible. There is a concept in trauma work called the accumulation of stress on the nervous system. So the nervous system does not process each event separately and then reset. It carries the load of what came before. So by this point in my story, I was carrying a childhood shaped by avoidance, developmental trauma, infertility, then 19 weeks of anticipatory grief, 3-day life and death of my daughter, the isolation of a new motherhood in a foreign country without family, and now the suicide of my mother. Each of those things alone would be significant, and together they created a weight that took years and a great deal of professional and personal work to begin to process properly. So grief for me has not been an event I moved through and came out on the other side of it. It has been a continuous companion. My daughter Ananda May is growing up, and she is a living reminder every day of joy and loss. Through her upbringing, she has asked many questions about her sister. She has asked me to daydream with her, to imagine what Amaya would look like, whether she would go to the same school, what she would be like. She even asked me, Mom, would Amaya look just like me? And I told her I imagine very similar, given you are identical twins. Not they were, they are identical twins. So parenting a twinless twin is a particular kind of ongoing grief, because every developmental milestone Ananda May reaches is also a marker of what Amaya did not reach. Every birthday is both celebration and absence. This is not a grief you complete. It is one you integrate, slowly, imperfectly, and continuously. So I had to learn how to carry both, to be fully present for Ananda May, and to remain honest about the presence of Amaya in our family, and to learn how to mother a non-physical child, and to model for my daughter that grief and joy are not opposites, that they can be both held together. Following that, I experienced the 2 miscarriages. And then about 10 years ago, I experienced a significant trauma in my adult life, which I also speak about in episode 44. I am naming it without detailing it because the detail is less important than the principle that trauma can arrive at any point in life, at any age, regardless of how much grief work you have already done, regardless of how much you know. And knowing the theory of trauma does not protect you from it. Being a therapist does not protect you from any of it. I had to practice what I had been preaching to my clients in my own life, with my own nervous system, with my own need for support. And as those of you following me know, this was followed by a separation from the father of the twins, an ending of a relationship that had contained all the previous losses, was itself a significant loss, even though it was decided with mutual respect. What we do not often recognize is that separation and divorce are also forms of grief. The loss of a shared future, the loss of the person who was with you through everything, the dismantling of a life structure that you built together. So I became a single mother. And there are still periods where navigating all of that is really challenging. So the exhaustion you feel when carrying multiple losses simultaneously is not weakness. It is the accurate physiological response to carrying more than one grief at a time. Your nervous system is doing its best. But it needs help. It cannot do this alone. So if you are hearing this today and it is resonating, if you recognize yourself in the accumulation of losses or traumas, in the complexity of layered grief, in the feeling that your grief is more than anyone around you seems to understand, there are free resources available for you right now. Go to my website and you can find there the free resource hub, where you can find the beginner's guide to dealing with grief and trauma, a free video series that gives you a starting framework for understanding and navigating what you are going through. The website also has resources specifically for those supporting the bereaved and for those who are traumatized. Go to nathaliehimmelrich.com and you can always find the link in the show notes. So, what my story has taught me. I want to bring all of this together now because I did not share my story simply to share it. I shared it to make a case for something I believe is one of the most important and underused tools in grief and trauma work. It is understanding your personal history. Here's what I mean. When Amaya died, I was not a blank slate. I was a person who had grown up in a family that modeled avoidance. A person whose nervous system had already been shaped by early developmental trauma. A person who had already grieved many small losses, friendships, and the loss of the motherhood she had imagined. So when grief arrived in its full force, in its impossible timing, it did not arrive into a neutral body. It arrived into all of that. And that history shaped how I grieved. The avoidance I had been taught meant that part of me wanted to stay functional, stay competent, not fall apart, even when falling apart was the appropriate and necessary response. The developmental trauma meant that my nervous system was already primed towards hypervigilance, already carrying a load before consciously knew it. The geographical isolation meant that the grief I needed to express had not many places to go. And this is not unique to me. Every person who is grieving today is grieving inside a personal history, inside a nervous system that remembers every previous loss or trauma, whether you have consciously processed those losses or not. Inside a family system that taught you, for better or for worse, what grief is allowed to look like. So when your personal grief feels bigger than the loss seems to warrant, it is almost always because the current loss has landed on top of unprocessed previous losses. When grief feels impossible to receive support for, it is often because the family system you grew up in did not show you how to receive support or how to ask for it. And when grief just keeps coming, as it has in my life, the task is not to become impervious to it. The task is to develop an increasing capacity to carry it, to process it and to integrate it. Not to get over it, but to weave it into who you are. So my losses have shaped me. They have shaped how I grieve, how I heal, how I sit with clients, and what I understand, not from a textbook, but from the inside, about what it costs to lose someone you love. So here's my invitation. What do I want you to take from this? If you're grieving right now or dealing with a trauma, I want you to consider this question. What did you learn about grief before this loss? What did your family teach you, explicitly or implicitly, about how you were allowed to feel, allowed to express, allowed to need? Who was permitted to grieve openly, and who was required to stay strong? What losses came before this one, and have they ever been properly witnessed? These questions are not diversions from your current grief. They are the ground it is growing in. And if you're supporting someone who's grieving, I want to offer you this reframe. The grief you are witnessing is probably not only about the loss you know about. It is about everything that came before it. Your role is not to fix the current loss. It is to be present for a person who may be carrying much more than you can see. This work, the work of understanding your own grief history, of making sense of why this loss at this time in this life feels the way it does, is the work I have given my professional life to. And it began, as most important things do, with my own. And as you, I'm still learning, I'm still integrating. I still have years, undoubtedly, where grief will arrive in forms I do not expect. But I know this. I am better equipped to carry it because I understand the story it arrived into. And so can you. Thank you for being here for this one. It was not a small thing to share and to record. So if this episode has moved something in you, if it has opened a question, named something you have been carrying, or helped you feel less alone in the complexity of your grief or dealing with your trauma, please share it with someone who needs it. You can also leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It takes 30 seconds and it can help more people to find this podcast when they need it. The free resources I mentioned are on my website, nathaliehimmelrich.com, and you can find there in the drop-down menu the free resources hub. And if you're ready to work with me directly, whether you're a griever or supporter, whether you're in Zurich, Switzerland, or anywhere in the world, you can find me at nathaliehimmelrich.com and book a discovery call. Take care of yourself and keep breathing. Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on nathaliehimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.